Hey everybody, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries, and we have another exciting interview today. I'd like to welcome Christopher Preston to the show. He is the pastor of Fairview Bible Church from Erie, Pennsylvania. Christopher, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks, Joe. Like I said, I'm fairly new to your channel, but I've already benefited very much. So I'm honored to be on here with you.
Oh, it's an honor to have you. Yeah, we're excited today. So as we're gonna this is a topic that's a little different than anything we've covered before on this channel. We're gonna be talking about the existence of the ether, and just really to start the conversation, we're hoping maybe you could just define what that is, tell us a little bit about it, and kind of explain why that may be relative for the audience.
Yeah, defining the ether is part of the problem, of course, and there are multiple different ether theories that have existed over the centuries, and it's kind of waffled back and forth, and even in the modern, 20th century and 21st century physics world, there are multiple ether theories. But to kind of boil it down to the lowest common denominator, the ether just refers to a universal medium that fills, or rather makes up, all of space. And so it serves as a carrier of light and electricity and force. It gives rise to all the physical phenomena that we know. So it's kind of the fabric that makes up the cosmos. It's the fundamental substrate of reality as we know it. And under different pressure conditions, it gives rise to all the phenomena we know in the physical universe. Historically, Christian theologians have connected the ether with the expanse of Genesis 1, the firmament, rakia. They tended to view, in the medieval era, they tended to view the expanse in Genesis 1 as a real stretched out fundamental fabric of the cosmos, and that's what they referred to as the ether. But the term ether comes from the ancient Greeks. It just means ether just means upper air. But
Okay.
So why is it pertinent to us? So I think, and I'll reiterate some of these points later, I think, but it definitely, understanding certain things about the ether exposes some of the false claims of materialism, and it kind of opens the door to an alternative to mainstream theories that are mostly based on relativity. It opens the door to new possibilities in physics and energy. The current physics discussion regarding energy and propulsion and whatnot all centers around this topic of the ether. And but particular to Christians, I think it just talking about it, dwelling on it some, challenges us to take dominion. We are to search out the hidden things of God, Proverbs 25:2, and I don't think that we should just leave all the interpretation of God's world to the pagans.
Right. Yeah, that's as relevant as anything. I mean, you're talking about we should have all of us, we should be seeking this understanding of God's creation, how it works, our place in it. So I like what you're getting at, because you define ether, but you're kind of hinting at really the relevance of some of these greater theological and even cosmological creation questions and how it affects all of us. So that's really, really cool. I think that sets the tone for the relevance of this conversation right off the bat. So that's excellent. Now, I think you kind of already hinted at this, but in our modern day, most scientists or physicists reject this concept of the ether, and obviously we're arguing for the existence of the ether. So what can you tell us about kind of the most common viewpoint today in the secular scientific world, and how should we think about that?
Yeah, so let me back up and get a running start to that to that answer, because what really got me turned on to this was actually the UFO UAP disclosure propaganda, shall we say? Because there are two things going on. Well, there's more than that, but there are two truths that are being disclosed, and at the same time, of course, continually obfuscated. But number one is that, we're not alone in the universe. And that's kind of what's being disclosed. But what's being covered up, of course, is the spiritual reality, particularly, in my opinion, the reality that factions in our government have knowingly been interacting with and taking orders from demonic entities. That's the reason for the secrecy. If it was just, well, there are aliens, at this point, that's not going to shake most of the population's fundamental understanding of reality. There's some darkness to the truth that has to be disclosed, which is why it's such a controlled, slow drip disclosure. And I think it's because of the spiritual realities behind it. But the second thing that's being disclosed, again, sorry, is my phone is buzzing. Are you hearing that?
I did not hear it, but no, you're good, brother. Go ahead.
All right. The second thing that's kind of being disclosed, again, in a controlled op, basically, with very closely set parameters. But what's coming out is that, I was going to say we, but that is humans, not the general public, obviously. But we have had extremely advanced technology for decades, and the two overlap correctly, I think. But on this technology side of things, what has come out more and more is the addressing of problems and limitations in our typical mainstream understanding of physics from an Einsteinian, I don't know if that's a word. I think I just coined that word. But
that's gonna get you famous here. So
yeah, from an Einsteinian framework, and one of the things that has come up in a lot of these discussions about various UAP and their various their obvious defying of the basic laws of physics as we understand them is the topic of 0-point energy. And forgive me, I haven't watched every one of your videos yet. Have you talked about 0-point energy?
No. So we're just assume we're at ground zero here.
Okay.
So
all right.
you can just run with that.
No problem.
Oh yeah. By the way, if you talk about UAPs, you're gonna scratch the itch of a lot of subscribers on this channel. So
okay.
That's great.
All right. So
anyway, go ahead.
The 0-point field is a term. It represents the lowest energy state of the vacuum of space, but it's characterized by somewhat random electromagnetic fluctuations, even at absolute zero temperature. That's why it's called the 0-point field, because at absolute zero, when there's not supposed to be any movement, any energy happening, it turns out that there's actually this incredible density and all these electromagnetic fluctuations that are still occurring at absolute zero, or hypothetically below. And so 0-point energy then refers to the idea that there's this incredible density at the smallest scale in the quantum vacuum, as they call it. And if man were to be able to tap into that dense energy and harness it, it would revolutionize the energy scene. But as I'm listening to all this and trying to wrap my head around this, I'm thinking, well, they're talking about the ether. And it's not exactly the classical ether, but it's definitely an ether theory. They don't seem to want to use that terminology. But if the empty vacuum isn't actually empty, and it's not actually a vacuum, but it's this ultra dense field teeming with electromagnetic fluctuations, well, then we're back to the basics of acknowledging that there's some sort of fundamental substrate, this underlying base fabric that makes up, all of space. It makes up the fundamental fabric of the universe. So you have, I'll come back around to why there is in fact an ether. Let me keep giving a lot of background.
Yeah.
The term ether is generally attributed to Aristotle. Now, the idea was around before him, but Aristotle proposed the ether, and the Greek word just means upper air, because he viewed it as starting past the sphere of the moon. So in the sublunar realm where we live, there's the four classical elements in the ancient world, earth, air, fire, water. And so Aristotle proposed that the ether was this fifth element. He called it the fifth essence, which is where the term quintessence comes from. So medieval Christians incorporated basically Aristotle's view of the ether as being a subtle substance that makes up space and is the medium for light, for example. But of course, the Christians understood the spheres of the cosmos as being created by and governed by the one true God. In the 17th century, the view of the ether kind of takes on this, it's kind of this extremely rarefied substance. So not a hyperdense substrate like in modern ether theories, but that's what's referred to as the luminiferous ether. And if you bring up the ether in pretty much any in most modern physics discussions, you're going to get laughed out of the room because the luminiferous ether is obviously laughable. But let me keep going on the history of it.
Yep.
Heinrich Hertz and James Clerk Maxwell. James Clerk Maxwell's big name in physics. We know his name even if we don't understand. I don't understand the Maxwell's equations, but that's what I'm most familiar with his name from is Maxwell's equations. But Maxwell's equations assume the existence of an ether. I have a quote by Maxwell. So yeah, James Clerk Maxwell said, "This medium of propagation, the ether, must exist. This medium must be a prominent thought in our investigations." So there's Maxwell. Now, of course, that's before the development of Einstein's relativity and whatnot. But I'm reading a book right now, just started a book by Sir Oliver Lodge. He's was an English physicist. He died in 1940. And he did a lot of work on the existence and nature of an ether. But he, I'll leave it alone. He's an interesting guy, Oliver Lodge.
No, yeah.
Nikola Tesla, of course, assumed and according to him, demonstrated the existence of the ether with his work in wireless power and whatnot. And Tesla said, contemporary of Einstein, and Tesla says, "They say much about Einstein's theory now. According to Einstein, the ether does not exist, and many people agree with him, but it is a mistake in my opinion. Ether's opponents refer to the experiments of Michelson-Morley, who made attempts to detect the Earth's movement relative to the fixed bed ether. These experiments failed. However, it didn't mean the ether's non-existence. I always based as fact the existence of mechanical ether in my works, and therefore I could achieve positive success." So he's basically saying he assumed the reality of an ether in his experiments, and he got positive results, and so he's arguing that demonstrates the existence of an ether.
Right.
The other book I'm reading right now is by Harold Aspden, and he was a British physicist. He died somewhat recently, 10 or 15 years ago. But Aspden proposed he explains the ether basically as that the universe is permeated by a dynamic, fluid-like crystalline structure that governs the formation and behavior of matter and energy. And so he basically says that this lattice ether is responsible for generating electric and magnetic fields and even for the propagation of light.
Right.
And so I'll come back to light in a second. So back over to zero-point energy. There are living physicists still today that are kind of big in the zero-point field work. Hal Puthoff is a big name in physics, and he was on. I haven't watched it yet. I just know that he was on Joe Rogan pretty recently. But the only reason I knew Hal Puthoff's name is actually because he was really involved with the CIA's work with remote viewing and all that.
Interesting.
Project Stargate. The CIA spent over 20 years exploring, experimenting with remote viewing and exploring its utility for military applications. Hal Puthoff was like in charge of that. But I'm reading a paper by Puthoff right now called Gravity as a 0-Point Fluctuation Force. And he treats the zero, he's assuming the Einsteinian framework to a more or less so. But he treats the 0-point field as some kind of real medium, which most people who function on the assumptions of relativity don't take it as a real actual medium. But of course, Puthoff's work in 0-point energy, he's arguing that this 0-point field is capable of being tapped into for propulsion and energy. Bernard Heisch is another big name in that. He worked with Puthoff, Alfonso Ruda. So why not just call it an ether, right? Well, basically because modern physics has a pride problem. They can't bring themselves to admit that the ancients and the medieval, the physicists and philosophers up until Einstein and the Christian worldview that they stood on were right all along. That's kind of what it comes down to.
Right.
I shared this part of this quote a few weeks ago. Robert Laughlin is a professor of applied physics at Stanford, and he says, "It is ironic that Einstein's most creative work, the general theory of relativity, should boil down to conceptualizing space as a medium when his original premise was that no such medium existed. The word ether has extremely negative connotations in theoretical physics because of its past association with opposition to relativity. This is unfortunate because, stripped of these connotations, it rather nicely captures the way most physicists actually think about the vacuum." Then he says, subsequent studies with large particle accelerators have now led us to understand that space is more like a piece of window glass than ideal Newtonian emptiness. It is filled with stuff that is normally transparent but can be made visible by hitting it sufficiently hard to knock out a part. The modern concept of the vacuum of space, confirmed every day by experiment, is a relativistic ether. But we don't call it that. We do not call it this because it is taboo. So, this is where the physics conversation is at right now. They just don't like the term ether. But one physicist that does use the term ether is Dr. Wei-Ping Yu, and he's a physicist at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And he has gotten some popular recognition lately for his understanding of light as a wave rather than a particle. He rejects the wave-particle duality theory of light as well. So I know I'm talking for a long time. Do you mind if I go on a tangent about light for a few minutes?
Yeah. Let me well, how about I just recap real quick, and then I'll let you go on your tangent. Well, first of all, just like you said, so the ether, it's this medium that fills all space through which light moves. I think I'm getting that correct.
Yeah.
And you're saying that, like, the Christian worldview essentially affirmed this for centuries, if not millennia, and we've moved, modern. As we move more and more into the modern age, scientists have moved away from this. And now you're saying that there are certain intellectuals who are starting to, even though they may not use that term, they're starting to make discoveries that are kind of moving back in that direction. Right. And then the one other thing I wanted to comment on is it's really fascinating that you said that you started looking at the UFP phenomenon that led you here. But then the implications you're saying for our understanding of energy, that seems to be as practical as anything. I mean, when I hear that I find that to be extremely fascinating, to say the least.
Yeah, it is. This was kind of where that's what Nikola Tesla was working on and trying to promote, and basically basically Einstein had better funding than Tesla, and so got his theory popularized. But
do you think if Tesla had continued on with his research longer than he was able to, do you think there were further energy breakthroughs that he was going to make?
Yeah, it could be. I think it's definitely possible.
Yeah,
hard to say, obviously, but there are people today that are like Eric Davis would be another big name in this field, that are working on a lot of the same stuff. Oh, Sonny White was on Joe Rogan recently as well. Sonny White had showed Rogan a little. It was basically like a SD card looking thing that he kind of made this passing comment about, like they have prototypes of these little devices that will draw on energy from the 0 point field, and then just moved on. And Rogan didn't like press him about it or anything. And I was like, whoa, hold on. Wait.
You wish you could have been the interviewer in that moment. You wish you could have hit the brakes there.
He just said that they have devices that have successfully tapped into the 0 point field and got this 0 point energy, or sometimes it's referred to as negative energy, because it's energy from this residual these residual electromagnetic fluctuations from this dense field that ordinarily it takes heat to have energy, right? So the 0 point energy, the idea is it's that you don't end up at no energy. There's actually this other kind of incredibly powerful energy that if you can tap into, it revolutionizes the energy scene. So yeah,
right.
crazy.
Right. That's fascinating. I know we could dwell there a lot longer than we have to, but anyway, I'm going to let you go on your tangent, as you said.
Yeah. I say tangent, but it is foundationally related to the topic at hand, and part of what launched me into all of this. So scientists and philosophers have long pondered the properties of light and proposed various theories of what exactly light is, usually bouncing back and forth between the wave theory and the particle theory of light. In the late 1600s, the wave theory gained more traction and in general, for a while, the wave theory was kind of gaining traction. But in the 1600s, that was kind of the established view. In the early 1700s, Newton argued for his corpuscular theory. He called it light is made up of tiny particles. But because Newton's theory struggled to explain certain phenomena, the wave theory became prominent for most of the 19th century. But then in the early 20th century, Einstein began developing his view of light as being emitted in discrete packets of energy, called photons, which, with his work on the photoelectric effect, which was only one particular interpretation of the photoelectric effect, which is you shine light at on a surface like metal, and you can basically jog loose. It ejects electrons off of that surface. It's called the photoelectric effect. And one particular interpretation of that is that what is happening is that you are shooting particles onto that surface. So with Einstein's argument about what is happening with light, there was kind of this reemergence and triumph of a theory of wave-particle duality. That light functions as a wave, but also sometimes as a particle, and in certain environments functions as a wave versus particle, or when it's observed, it functions differently and stuff like that. Right. But in reality, Einstein's work on all that was in large part an effort to establish a theory of light that removed the need for any supposed medium to be required across which light would travel, because he wanted space to be empty.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Well, just commenting on what you just said. So Einstein, he was trying to, in his theories, he wanted to get rid of this idea of the ether, of this medium through which light moves, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you think would you call that a bias? Is that fair to say that he had a bias in that direction?
I don't know if it's fair to say that, but I would say that.
Well, that's fair enough for me then.
Yeah.
But what do you just? I know that I had this later in my notes, but this is fine. What would you say is his motivation for that? Why was he thinking the way he was about that?
Depends on how much trouble you're trying to get me into, as far as how I answer that. I think
I'm trying to get you at least a little bit of trouble. So.
I think that the main reason, it seems that the prominent reason that he was trying to eliminate the existence of the ether was that he was trying to he was trying to insist on and support the Copernican Principle, and the Michelson-Morley experiment and Miller's experiments later, which we can come back to in a minute. There's a guy, Dayton Miller, that kind of replicated with better equipment and in a different environment Michelson-Morley's experiments, and basically repeated the results, but more with more specificity, and really strengthens the argument of what the Michelson-Morley experiment ended up demonstrating. Yeah. And so Einstein wants to remove that particular interpretation of Michelson-Morley's experiment, because he has this, do what you will with the Copernican, the cosmological principle. Copernican principle is the idea that the Earth does not enjoy any kind of privileged position in the cosmos, and do what you want with the reality of that or not. Einstein and most physicists that have followed him have a pretty religious dogma that drives them to holding up that principle, and they do not want anything that indicates that Earth is in any kind of privileged, position that points to a designer or anything.
Right.
That I'd say that's probably his main motivation.
Right, and you would say, because if the Earth is the center, if we're in that privileged position, as you put it, the implications of that theologically or toward a creator is something that they want to avoid. Right. And so that's an important point. Is there anything else you wanted to say on that front before we go to the next question?
Let me finish a thought about light real quick.
Yep.
Because then it brings us back into this answering the question of why is there an ether? I mean, why would we argue that there is an ether? So Dr. Yu, among other people, but he's who I kind of launched me onto this, explains that light is propagated vibrationally, like electricity. It causes a disturbance in the medium. And so he assumes and argues that there is in fact a medium that light moves across. Walter Russell, not a super respected, not a credentialed, respected physicist. He worked with Tesla some. But Walter Russell had this phrase, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, light does not travel. And what he meant was that the sun is not emitting physical particles that are traveling from the sun to us. This light is not emitting physical particles that are hitting me on the top of the head. Light causes a vibration in the medium that it's a wave function, and so why is blue light bad for you? Especially at night when people shift their phone settings toward the red end of the spectrum. Why? Well, because blue light has a shorter frequency, a tighter wave, so more energy. There's more excitation of the medium, more agitation to your eyes, your brain, or your skin for that matter. But it's all because of the wave function of light. So why is that important to our conversation? Well, because if light is a wave, if it's just if it's propagated vibrationally, it requires a medium. But we've been told that space is this empty vacuum, and there is no medium. So, as I said, the idea of the quantum vacuum being an actual empty vacuum is somewhat quickly being discarded, which is really fascinating to watch. But they still physicists still tend to use the terminology of an empty vacuum. They call it the quantum vacuum. Sometimes they'll call it the 0-point field, or quantum foam, is an older phrase, or space-time. Einstein's term space-time. I always think of space-time, and I've always thought of space-time as though it's some kind of actual thing. And,
Right.
and in Einstein's argumentation of space-time, it's not an actual thing. It's empty nothingness. That so when he talks about the curvature of space-time and things like that, there's nothing actually on relativity. There's nothing actually bending. It's just this geometric mathematical equation that makes sense of the observations we have, but it's not actually this physical medium. Because if there's this physical medium, well, then we're talking about an ether.
Right.
So we've kind of come to this place where physics has decided to just assert that the vacuum isn't empty after all. It's this extremely dense field teeming with electromagnetic fluctuations. We just refuse to call it an ether. So I want to recover the ether concept as being not a relic of outdated physics, but a fundamental framework that unifies energy and light, matter, gravity, motion.
Right. Yeah, and as you said, because in the implications of it, and in many different fields, that's why it's important to talk about. Yeah, that's excellent. Now you mentioned Michelson-Morley. Now, and we've kind of touched upon that, but I want to expand upon that a little bit. Can you just kind of tell us, what is the Michelson-Morley experiment? What were they trying to do? What were their findings? And why is that experiment relevant to what we're talking about?
Yeah, Albert Michelson and Edward Morley had this experiment in the late 1880s. Do you know the date off the top of your head?
It's 1880s.
87.
Yeah, we'll get our fact checkers on that.
Yeah. There was a similar experiment earlier in the 80s, but what everybody refers to as the Michelson-Morley experiment was 1887. Michelson and Morley designed an interferometer, this thing that measures interference, to basically, in order to detect the ether wind. They wanted to see a change in the speed of light due to Earth's motion through the ether. So light beams were sent in on this device they made, which was like a big table. Light beams were sent in two perpendicular directions, one along Earth's motion and one perpendicular to it. And so they expected to see a fringe shift due to the, and you can see it. And if you look up, fringe shift of light. You can see like photographs of what that looks like. But they expected to see fringe shift due to the different times that light would take in each path. The way that we often hear about it is that the experiment found no detectable difference in the speed of light depending on direction, a null result. And so Einstein's special relativity, general relativity is later, but Einstein's special relativity was a deliberate fudge to explain away the implications of the Michelson-Morley null result. Because the argument, the way that we typically hear that explained is that the Michelson-Morley experiment shows that the Earth is stationary, and Einstein, couldn't have that, and so he just discarded the ether. If there's no detection of the ether, then either Earth is stationary or we can just discard the ether. But it's actually a little more complex than that, because Michelson and Morley did not find a true null result. There was a small positive result, but it just was nothing close to what would be required for the Earth to be orbiting the sun at 30 kilometers per second or whatever it is, 66,000 miles per hour. So there was this slight positive result, but it certainly was negative. It was a negative result for the attempt to measure the Earth moving around the sun. So there were later experiments, but Einstein just kind of, it all has to do with just kind of how you interpret Michelson and Morley's results. And Einstein just kind of framed it in a certain way in order to argue that they didn't detect the ether because it doesn't exist. But there were later experiments replicating this process as well, most notably by a guy named Miller, Dayton Miller, in the 1920s. But it's been repeated as recently as the early 2000s. And those repeated experiments also consistently get a small positive result. And Miller demonstrated an increased result with increased altitude. And it also depended on whether the experiment was conducted at nighttime or during the day. And both of those both of those variables actually strengthen the evidence that what is occurring is that that it's not just instrument errors or something like that, but that they are actually detecting an ether of some sort. And the reason you would detect it at higher elevation better is partly because of the interference of other objects. Like if you try to detect wind, but you're on the other side of a mountain, you're not going to detect the wind as much as if you're on the other side of the mountain or up on the top of the mountain. But also because in some particular ether theories, like Aspton's, that rotation, whether you're talking about a stationary Earth with the cosmos rotating around it, or a stationary cosmos with a rotating Earth, either way, the results are the same. That there's this torsional tension that's put on the ether, and it basically creates these pressure differentials, and so you end up with a pressure sink around mass, and so you effectively fall downhill, towards the mass. But because of that, you would be able to, if that were true, you would be able to detect. You would have slightly more positive results with higher altitude. You'd also have slightly more. You'd have slightly different results with the sun being out and things like that.
Right.
So Miller's experiments are really fascinating to me. But then, of course, Michelson-Gale So Michelson-Morley, they were looking for the speed of the Earth around the sun. Michelson and Gale they aimed to measure the rotation, so it's a little bit different. And again, they got a positive result that matches the 24-hour sidereal day, but basically, mainstream science's response to the Michelson-Morley experiments and Miller's experiments is basically that there's instrument error, or there was thermal drift, like heat just affects the readings or something. Einstein actually hired, after Miller's experiments, Einstein hired a guy to examine the results, and they basically dismissed it as due to statistical margin of error, or partly due to local temperature conditions, things like that.
Right. So if I'm correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, when Michelson and Morley, they wanted to prove that the Earth was moving around around the sun. That was and they were, even if I remember the history of it correct, when they didn't get the results they wanted, they were actually very disappointed about it.
Yeah.
And I'm just making that point to show that, like, what they found wasn't what they wanted to be found. It's not like there was some bias. There wasn't some bias pushing them a certain direction. If anything, they were very shocked and surprised by what they found. And just to summarize what you're saying very much in layman's term, they were shooting these beams of light perpendicular to each other. And the idea is that if the Earth is moving around the sun, that the speed going one way should be very, very, very different than going the other way. And you're saying that the results of the tests, even though you said there was a negligible difference, I think is how you would say it, it did not support this idea of what they wanted, that the Earth was moving around the sun.
Yeah, it's a really valuable data point, because you can chalk things up things like that up to bias or something, but it's not the results they wanted. And I should have printed off. I should have looked up the quote. But I've read Michelson's comments about that, and it is kind of it's kind of like a shocked disappointment of that this goes against the expected result, and the seeming implication of the Earth being at least relatively stationary is unacceptable. I don't remember if it's Michelson that uses that word, but that's basically the idea. Is that, it's not the result they were looking for.
And I just wanted, that's important because, like you said, that the finding of this experiment, for many different reasons by many different people, gets explained away. And I think that's for the sake of clarity, that historical perspective is important.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you said that I think is very, very helpful is that you're saying that this test has been reproduced by others multiple times. So to try to explain away the results of this experiment through things like instrumentation error, or people me paraphrasing it, is it wasn't some type of a fluke. That's another very, very important point.
Right.
Yeah. And like you would, and I mean, one of the reasons why I'm interested by the Michelson-Morley experiment, because I think it does prove what you've been talking about, that the Earth is not moving around the sun. I know we have a few cosmological differences, but the point is that what we're arguing and saying is that we are in a special privileged position, and that's a very, very critical point.
Right. It is possible. I had a note somewhere. I'll come back to it.
I should put commercial breaks into these interviews.
Yeah,
so
right.
You can look at your notes.
Look stuff up. There's even assuming the existence of an actual physical fundamental substrate to reality, fabric that makes up space. Even assuming that, there are a couple of ways to interpret the Michelson-Morley experiment. One of them is that they didn't detect it because the Earth is stationary. Another thing would be they didn't detect it because the Earth isn't experiencing ether drag. It's not pushing through the ether. Another interpretation would be that, in other words, even if it is moving, it doesn't have to push through the ether to move. Another way to interpret it is that, where I would take it is, I think that they consistently got positive results with this because they are finding those readings that show the existence of the ether. It's just not enough, but they find different results with altitude and whatnot because of this, because of gravitation, basically, because of this torsional tightening of the ether around mass, and so that kind of plays into it. My point being just that there are a couple of ways to deal with the results, but it is interesting that based on Einstein's need for the one interpretation of the result to not be the case, he comes up with this whole new model of physics in order to discard the necessity of an ether at all.
Right. And you've said that multiple times, that a lot of this comes down to how you're interpreting the data. That's something you've said a few times in this interview. Yeah. And that's probably a good transition into my next question, is that we've been kind of going through the history, and we worked our way up to the 1880s, and now we're really up to Einstein, who you've talked about multiple times. And Einstein he's probably the most famous physicist in history, maybe arguably the most famous scientist in history. I guess you could put him up there with somebody like Isaac Newton. And he has these two theories of special relativity and general relativity. And if I'm not mistaken, pretty much those theories are the bedrocks of modern theoretical physics. And it's almost, I would almost go as far to say it's essentially scientific dogma, those two theories. So what can you tell us about Einstein, his theories of both special relativity and general relativity, and basically how that's tying into what we're talking about?
Yeah. Let me preface this, and by that I mean I should have prefaced this entire interview with the fact that I'm a pastor, right? I'm not a physicist. This is just something I've always been interested in, things like this. But so with that caveat, I'll tell you what I know about special relativity and general relativity. Einstein's special relativity was published in 1905, and it was in large part to answer the Michelson-Morley experiment. So there's quite a bit of time between those things, but Einstein's theory is finally published. His special relativity paper is published in 1905. And special relativity, basically, his goal was to redefine the laws of physics in order to allow for there to be no ether needed, and the speed of light is constant in all frames of reference. So it's basically comes down to time and space become relative to the observer. There is no absolute frame of rest, and so time and space become relative to the observer. This leads to his views on time dilation, and if you ever watch any kind of sci-fi-ish show or movie ever, they're going to deal with stuff like time dilation at some point, right? And but that comes from special relativity. Length contraction was a big thing because Fitzgerald and Lorentz, their Lorentz contraction was basically Fitzgerald and Lorentz, their argument for the Michelson-Morley's results was basically that the physical length of the device contracts with due to the pressure of the ether. That was what Fitzgerald and Lorentz said. Einstein doesn't want the ether to exist, so he has a slightly different explanation for it. He just basically just makes it a mathematical formula and says this is just what happens. It's not because of any kind of physical resistance from the ether. It just is a mathematical fact that there's length contraction with motion, and there's time contraction and dilation with motion. But it also, he also messed with simultaneity. In other words, it becomes relative. What happens at the same time depends on your frame of reference. So it's basically like, it's called relativity because it's completely relativistic. Everything just depends on on the observer's frame of reference, and the cold hard facts are completely different from somebody else's frame of reference. And of course, the most pertinent to our discussion, his whole what special relativity successfully does with mathematical formulas is eliminates the need for an ether, and it redefines space and time as this four-dimensional space-time continuum of nothingness, which can be plied and warped and isn't really nothingness, but that's beside the point. So that was special relativity. But then general relativity is he published general relativity in 1915, and basically the goal was to extend his work with special relativity to scale it up and to account for and include gravity in his equations and whatnot. And so general relativity proposes that mass and energy curve space-time. But remember, according to special relativity, space-time is just nothingness. It's just geometry. But mass and energy curve space-time, and objects move along those curves. So gravity, and this was an important, ironically, it gets back closer to an ether type view of gravity as opposed to Newtonian gravity, which was kind of just direct magnetic pull. And so in Newtonian gravity, you could have objects at a great distance with no medium between them just pull on each other because there's I mean, he didn't chalk it up to a physical magnetism, but it was just this pull. Einstein ironically gets back to something very similar to what an ether theory view of gravity would be, which is basically that it's not a pulling that's occurring, it's really just an actual falling downhill towards the bottom of the pressure gradient. That's how I would word it, but that's how an ether theory would word it.
Right.
But in general relativity, it's not an actual physical tightening or gathering of a lattice ether or anything like that. It's just this mathematical formula for so it's odd that he worded it as, and everybody words it as, bending space-time, but there's nothing actually there to actually bend. It's just that there are these curved movements that are forced upon light and objects and whatnot. Geodesics is what it's called, these curved paths in space-time. And so it predicts this. I use this example in my sermons sometimes. Scientific endeavors, theoretical physics especially, is in large part based on a technical logical fallacy, a fallacy of the excluded middle, because general relativity predicts that light will bend around mass. If general relativity were true, you're gonna be able to see light bend around mass, because the mass has this curvature power to it, and everything, including light, follows the geodesics, follows those curved paths that the mass creates. And so if relativity is true, you're going to see light bend around mass. Well, then later, that's proven. We can actually witness light bend around mass. And so the conclusion is, well, there we go. General relativity is proven.
Right.
And technically, that's kind of how you have to do science. You present a hypothesis, you test it, the expected result, the expected result holds, and so you continue to work on that on the basis of that hypothesis. That's fine, but we have to understand that it's technically a logical fallacy, because just because the observation does match the prediction doesn't mean that's why we're seeing that why we're able to make that observation. There are other possible explanations for why light might bend around mass. So that was a completely unnecessary aside.
No, I think you nailed it. Let me see if I can just recap it once again in very much in layman's terms. But I mean, Einstein's model, based on his theories of relativity, removed this concept of the ether, which is this medium through which light moves. So, I mean, as you said, according to Einstein, space is an empty vacuum. And if I'm hearing you correctly, but then in his theories, he's talking about space-time, and which seems, maybe if I'm getting this right, that sounds kind of contradictory.
It is, and Einstein actually granted that. He acknowledged that later, that he basically is talking about it like it's he uses the term ether. It's pretty. I have it somewhere.
Okay, I must be tracking with you a little bit. If it sounds like I hit the right nerve point, so I'm doing okay here, keeping up with you.
Yeah, right. Einstein said in 1905. What year is this? 19. I don't know what year this is. This is much later.
You said special relativity is 1905.
Special relativity is 1905. Einstein, much later, he says, in 1905, I was of the opinion that it was no longer allowed to speak about the ether in physics. This opinion, however, was too radical. And then he goes on to basically acknowledge that the way he talks about space-time sounds physical, even though he doesn't want it to be a physical ether. So he grants that.
Which is
which is really ironic that Einstein admits that, but the way that physics has functioned since Einstein kind of ignores that side of it. We talk about it as an empty vacuum.
Yeah. Well, let me ask. I hope this is the right way to phrase this question, but let me ask it. So, assuming that what we're postulating is correct and the ether does exist, when you get to the implications, what does that do for Einstein's theories?
Einstein himself says that if Michelson-Morley's experiment holds, and he's talking about Miller's experiment. He basically says if Michelson-Morley's experiment demonstrates the existence of or the stationariness of Earth, Michelson-Morley, then that is a real problem for relativity, because because in relativity you can't have an absolute frame of reference. And then he specifically said if Miller's arguments are if Miller's interpretation of his results are accurate, it undoes relativity. So
basically, if Michelson-Morley's findings are correct, and if the Earth is not moving, if those things are both true, then the entire modern cosmological understanding of physics based on Einstein's theories of relativity falls apart.
Right. And modern physics is, like you said at the very beginning, is based on Einstein. Einstein is the defining standard of modern physics.
Right. So, I mean, that says a lot right there. That says a lot why we're talking about this. That's
Right.
a pretty major point. Wow. That's phenomenal to quote our president. That's phenomenal. All right. Before we move ahead, is there anything else you want to cover before we go to the last question?
No.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're kind of at the point where we're getting to the summary. So in summary, taking everything that you've explained for us, and this has been great. It's been fantastic. What should be our takeaways of light and the ether and our discussion as a whole? Like, what do you want us to walk away from this conversation with?
I think that one of the key takeaways for me is to remember that the science is not settled, which it's rarely ever the case, especially in theoretical physics, that the science is settled, right? It's always repeating experiments and getting different results, or even if you get the same results, there are other explanations for why you're getting those results. The science is not really settled most of the time. And actually, this is an important point for Christian apologetics and hermeneutics. When it comes to the discussion of the Bible versus science, we frequently make a category error. For example, by talking about it as the Bible versus science. The Bible is interpreted, and our method of interpretation, the craft of interpreting the Bible, is called hermeneutics. Science is not the established raw data. Science is the hermeneutic with which we seek to interpret the data of creation. And so we interpret the Bible, we call that hermeneutics. We interpret the cosmos, we call that science or physics or whatever. But what happens when our understanding of the Bible and our understanding of the universe don't seem to match up? Well, the problem is not with the Word of God, but nor is the problem with his creation. The problem is somewhere in our understanding. Now, our interpretation of Scripture may be wrong, but our interpretation of the cosmos can also be wrong. And sometimes we're brought back around to the realization that Christians in the past who were godlier and smarter than us actually sometimes got it right. And science just takes a while to catch back up.
Right.
So why should we care about any of this? Well, on the one hand, because we should want to know the truth. Truth is a transcendental, like goodness. Why should we pursue what is good? Well, because God is good and we are to imitate him. Why should we believe what is true? Well, because God is true. We're called to think God's thoughts after him.
Right.
But also, again, understanding God's creation is a fundamental aspect of exercising mastery, dominion of creation and fulfillment of the dominion mandate of Genesis 1. We also, especially from the truther angle, it is important to understand the motivations and presuppositions from which people have arrived at their conclusions. And sometimes, often in these areas, the motivations have to do with avoiding the obvious implication that we were created with a specific design in a specific place for a specific purpose by a specific creator. Because if that's true, then the creator has a right to tell us how to live. We're accountable to him. And of course, we've all failed to live in accordance with his righteous standard. The good news
amen.
is that Christ died for us. Any who trust on him can have eternal life. So we can't let that supreme truth get lost in the mix of everything that is interesting and intriguing about this world. The most important message is that Christ is the Savior who's coming to redeem and reign over his world.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, and I mean, I love how you said that, because like what you're saying is God has revealed himself through his creation. That's what's called general revelation. And he reveals himself through his word, which is what theologians call special revelation. What you're saying is those two things are in harmony with each other. They're not going to contradict each other the way that God is revealing himself to us. So if we have, from our fallible human vantage point, something that appears to be contradicting, the problem isn't with the revelation. The problem is with us.
Right.
And I like how you're saying the implications is, if we're living in this world that has been created by God, by the Lord, well, the implication of that is that we have to live in subservience to our Creator. And in my opinion, that really comes full circle, because you've said that throughout the history of science, there have been people, scientists, who have not wanted to admit that we are in that special privileged position because of the fact that they were really, this is my opinion, that they wanted to get away from this accountability to a creator. Right. And I think that's such a great note to really end on, is you're talking about Christ. He came to this world. He died for the sin of sinners, and that the Savior and the King that's really what all of these discussions should be going towards. So I love that emphasis. That's great. So, okay. Well, I think we covered anything. Is there anything else? Any other last thoughts, disclaimers, anything that you want to get out to the audience?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
This has been a delight.
I've really enjoyed it too. Thank you for being willing to come on, Christopher. Before we sign off, tell everybody how they can get in touch with what you're doing, whether your material on the internet or your ministry. Let us know how we can be connected to what you're doing.
Oh, what would be so encouraging to me is if people would subscribe to and share my Substack. It's tophpreston.substack.com. So TOPH, like Christopher, tophpreston.substack.com. And on there, I have a subsection called Into the Ether. And that's where I'm right by, I've just started. So get in on the ground level. Just kidding. I have a few things about this, about the UFO phenomena and spiritual warfare and how those all connect, that I want to get down. And so I don't see this as being perpetual, but I have some things I want to get down, and I have a few posts up on the UFO stuff. And my next post coming up is starting the conversation on spiritual warfare. And so, that would be wonderful if people would follow me on there, tophpreston.substack.com. That's my church is Fairview Bible Church, and you can always listen to sermons on there. But I don't like to recommend people listening to me because I don't like listening to myself. But if you want to read my stuff, and some of it's going to definitely overlap with some of what we've been talking about, that's where to go.
Yeah, for sure. And I read a number of your articles before this interview, and I can recommend them. They're very good. So I will include the link to your Substack in the description for this video, so people can just click on it and they'll be able to find it. Okay. Find it really easily.
Make sure I got the URL right.
Okay. We'll try the support team, and that is me. We'll make sure that we get that down the way we should. Well, yeah, like I said before, Christopher, this has been a really fun conversation. I've really enjoyed it. So, yeah, thank you for being willing to come on to Reformed Truther Ministries.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody. This has been this installment of RTM. Stay tuned. We got a lot more exciting stuff coming up down the pike with Reformed Truther Ministries. So, all that being said, this has been Christopher Preston and Joe Harper signing off. So, God bless everybody. If you have been blessed by the ministry of RTM, then please consider supporting our ministry through Buy Me a Coffee, and check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.